So, the lecture is in 3 parts. I first summarize the outcomes, as it were, of yesterday's lecture about the state as the political form of historically specific social relations. I now then go a little bit into Pashukanis and his theory of law. And I will argue there that Pashukanis doesn't really grasp the class relations, which I then introduce with reference to Marx' Capital, chapters 6, 23, and 24, sections 1 and 3. That sounds complicated. Don't worry. Marx is a critique of economics, and I don't understand economics, so I'm not going to give you an economic argument. The idea of freedom of exploitation, the title could also have been equality and exploitation. It doesn't make much difference, so either equality or freedom and exploitation. I argued, those who were there in the first lecture, that bourgeois norms, like freedom, equality, justice, etc., are implicated by the violence of their creation, and that they are therefore not universal categories, but categories that belong to a specific kind of society, i.e. to bourgeois society. And it is this insight, I think, that I will be talking about between the lines right through the lecture. Okay? So yesterday, the class character I argued about the capitalist state is entailed by its independence from bourgeois society. The class character of the state, I argue, consists in it being the organized force and the organized power of bourgeois society. It lays down and enforces the rules of the game and treats the social individuals as abstract individuals endowed with standardized rights. And by treating the individuals as equals before the law, it reproduces the inequality in property between the contracting parties. You will remember yesterday, I almost said last week, yesterday, I concluded by saying that the state forbids poor and rich equally to steal bread. So nobody is discriminated against. It's just one person or one class might have to steal bread in order to satisfy their needs and wants, and yet by treating them as equals, Marx argues they are treated as in an unequal manner. For Marx, the idea of equal rights is in fact a right of inequality. And he puts that particularly strongly, I think, in relationship to money. So here I go, a quote. He says, "The power which each individual exercises over the activity of others or over social wealth exists in him as the owner of exchange value, the owner of money." In other words, money treats everybody as equal. Money doesn't discriminate against people, but the individuals carry their social power as well as their bond with society in their pockets. We can see by treating them as equals in front of money or before money, they are in fact treated inequally. Is that the right word to use? Because the power they exercise over social wealth and over others is in their pockets, is in their wallets. I argued further that the seller of labor power, his or her access to the means of subsistence, is contingent upon her ability to achieve a labor contract. Without employment, no wages. Without wages, the access to the means of subsistence are very much restricted. And if you don't sell your labor power, what else can you sell to make a living? For lots of people, particularly in our time, the need or the requirement to migrate becomes almost like a necessity. From areas where there is no employment or employment is difficult to achieve, to areas where employment might be acquired, might be got, and how many of those drawn in the Mediterranean Sea. So for the laborer, to get a wage contract is absolutely essential for his or her subsistence. In this context, Adorno speaks about freedom as a freedom to dodge starvation through employment, through wage income. I argued further that as a consequence, therefore, the laborer, the seller of labor power, depends on the capitalist to exploit him or her well. A capitalist who doesn't make a profit from the employment of labor goes under, will be liquidated. And bankrupt employers don't hire labor power. They make labor power or labor redundant. They shed. There is therefore, I suppose, a thing that is much more harsh and much more difficult for the laborer than exploitation. And that is to be a redundant, unexploitable laborer. An unexploitable laborer is basically an economic zero. No money in his or her pocket. Precarious connection to social wealth, and always in danger of being cut off from access to the means of subsistence. So the laborer is compelled, not by personal forms of dependency, but by circumstances, by economic circumstances, or by, as it were, or as a consequence of his or her acquired freedom. Compelled to work, compelled to make a living, founded on the, as it were, effective exploitation of her labor power, and yet she remains a free subject, responsible only for herself. Remember yesterday I referred to Adam Smith, who said that a free man is much better than a slave because a free man is cheaper than a slave. Because the slave is not self-responsible in periods of economic decline, the slave still needs to be fed, and is therefore, Adam Smith argued, an expense to the slave owner. Whereas the free laborer is no such expense, because the free laborer is responsible for him or herself. The employer is not responsible for the well-being of the free laborer. So, on the one hand, I argued that the relationship between capital and labor vanishes in the economic appearance of capitalist wealth as an exchange of one sum of money for a greater sum of money. And I argue that the exchange relationship appears in its political form as a relationship between equal legal subjects that are at liberty to pursue their own interests by means of contract through an equivalent exchange between the buyer and seller of labor power. An equivalent exchange here means that the bourgeois form of wealth, the rights of private property, exclude the idea of robbery and theft. So wealth is exchanged, or is made, not on the basis of robbery, not on the basis of theft, but through a trade by means of contract between two contracting parties, one of which relinquishes a commodity, the commodity labor power, for a wage, and the other acquires it, and once it has been acquired, has acquired the right to use it. And the trade between these parties is argued is based on an equivalent exchange between the owners of commodities, including the owner of the commodity labor power. The state is responsible for the security of social order, the rule of law, the inviolability of money as a standard of exchange, and also for the morality of self-responsible entrepreneurship. So the state, then I argued, is the collective power of the law of private property, and the law of private property, as I argued yesterday in relationship to Adam Smith, is the law of valorization of property through the constant attempt at increasing the productivity of labor. Therefore, Smith argued that every issue concerning the manufacturing or commerce of our country is a matter of police, by which he means public policy. So on the one hand, we have a relationship between capital and labor, in which the participants struggle. The capitalist struggles to prevent bankruptcy. The capitalist struggles to enrich himself, and enrichment is a necessity to prevent bankruptcy. And the worker struggles to achieve access and to maintain access to the means of subsistence and also over the conditions of work, with the capitalist insisting, as is his right according to the rights of private property, to consume the acquired commodity, labor power, as he sees fit, inasmuch as the worker relinquished that commodity in exchange for a wage. Marx argues, when it turns to the struggle about the length of the working day, that the struggles over the length of the working day pitted right against right. We have a sense, I guess, why there is a right on the part of the capitalists to work the worker as he sees fit, because he has acquired the right to consume the relinquished commodity, labor power. What, however, is the right of the worker? And right is pitted against right. And Marx argues that the right of the worker is simply this. The worker didn't sell him or herself. The worker sold a commodity, the commodity labor power. And the worker did so with the expressed purpose to make a living. It makes sense, no? So, the commodity labor power is slightly different from other commodities. If I buy an apple, I bite it. I chew it. And that's it. I destroy the apple by consuming it. Now, I've acquired your labor power. Can I chew you? Can I bite you? Clearly not. Because you have not sold yourself, have you? You sold the commodity labor power to me. I bought it with the expressed purpose that I valorize it for my profit. And in a way, you're dependent upon that too, because your future employment depends on the profitability of your labor. But can I chew you like I chew the apple? When I bought your labor power, and we come to the factory gate, are you taking your hands off, like screwing them off, giving them to me, and say to your hands, I'm back shortly, when your work is finished, and then I'm going to recollect them, put them back on, and go home? Clearly not. So the commodity labor power is specific, because its consumption entails the consumption of its seller, who has not sold him or herself. Yeah? So the right of the worker as a person is the right of a private property owner to not be killed prematurely as a consequence of the manner in which the acquirer of my labor power consumes the person who has not sold himself. So there's right against right, Marx argues. The right of the buyer of labor power to consume what he has bought, and the rights of his seller not to be consumed by the consumption of his or her labor power. And he argues between a struggle of right against right. Who decides is the state. by setting down the rules of the game, by outlawing certain working practices, by outlawing child labor below a certain age, by setting standards of work in terms of health and safety, and by setting standards concerning the length of the working day. So in this conflict between right and right, the state decides through legalizing the relationship, through regulating the relationship, by putting down norms of conduct, rules of conduct. So the legislation of the social relations entails also their stratification. The state is not in society, but regulates the social conduct by means of law and by means of the enforcement of law. Yeah, so far okay? Is the Victorian imperialist state of Britain at the time of Marx's writing a state that set a standard in terms of the length of the working day, a state that, as it were, exercised its power of rule and lawmaking on behalf of the labourers? Was that state of Victorian imperialist England a socialist state? Just because it came down on the side of labour, reducing the hours of work, I don't know from what, let's say from 18 hours to 12. Is that a socialist state? Today we would say, oh yeah, that's socialism, isn't it? That's what we expect from a left-wing party. That's what we expect from persons like Corbyn, to lower the working day. But it was done by a Victorian imperialist state of Britain. Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher, complained bitterly when child labour was outlawed, I think, under the age of 14. I'm making this number up. But 4 years, from 10 to 14, children were not meant to be working in mines. And there was Jeremy Bentham complaining bitterly. 4 years lost for profit. 4 years lost for industry. 4 years lost for civilization. 4 years lost for progress. And he is right. But does this outlawing of child labour under the age of 14, did that make that state a sort of quasi-socialist state that set the rules of the game favouring the political economy of labour over the political economy of capital? And I would say, no, it's not a socialist state at all. It is a proper capitalist state. It limits the consumption of labour power, that is true. It sets down the conditions of trade on the labour market. It regulates the conditions of health and safety at work. It disallows certain labour practices. In our time, it might even come about to say this is a minimum wage. We cannot pay anybody below that wage. In any case, it sets the standards of the contract. It sets down the rules of the game. But does it do away with the labour market? I don't know whether you are on the labour market, but if you are, what are you trading? What are you selling on a labour market? Why go there in any case? Why not stay at home? Lazy about a bit. Much more fun than trading. What is being traded on the labour market? What is sold? What is bought? according to which conditions? And the conditions we now have are not naturally charactered. They're not God-given or nature-given. They are the outcome of a prolonged struggle over the conditions of trade. So this Victorian state set down the conditions of trade. It recognized the political economy of labor and protected thereby the working class as society's surplus value producer. In addition, of course, it also protected the future recruitment of soldiers. You don't want cripples to shoot on your behalf. But in this context, Marx says, quite ironically, the chains by which the working class is tied to the capitalist have become more golden. But chains, they remained. Clearly, it's much better to be chained by something more golden than by something rusty and tight around your hands, but doesn't do away the chains. So this is my summary of yesterday's lecture and the implications of that lecture. Now let's change topic to freedom and exploitation. And I will run through the same kind of argument again, but this time with a different perspective. I will first look at Pashukanis' general legal theory in Marxism, which was published originally for the first time in 1924, in other words, 100 years ago. I will argue that in its appearance, exploitation assumes the form of legal equality, and it assumes the form of freedom. I argue that legal equality belongs to specific social relations. It is a form founded on social order and social peace. The premise of law and legal regulation is the depoliticization of the social relations as relations of contract and as relations of entrepreneurial will. So the law of contract doesn't apply to a rebellious society, doesn't apply to insurrections. It applies to a society which is well ordered. And the power of order making is the state, and the state is also the power of lawmaking and the power of the enforcement of law. So the premise, as it were, of contractual relations is the political state as the independent power of law and order. Pashukanis, born 1891, died prematurely in September 1937, killed by Stalinism, executed as a traitor. He was a legal scholar, best known for this book, The General Theory of Law and Marxism. He advocated for a philosophy of law that the Soviet authorities considered to be threatening to their regime. And the, as it were, philosophy of law that he advocated was that the rule of law is in bourgeois in character, and that there can be no such thing in a socialist, let alone in a communist society. Pashukanis was a socialist. He engaged in socialist activism early in his life, was expelled by the Tsarist police and left Russia for Germany in 1910, studying law at Munich University. He returned to Russia in 1914, joined the Russian Communist Party, became a judge in Moscow in 1918, then a legal scholar and government advisor. He became a judge, so I mentioned that. He helped to draft the Repeller Treaty of 1922, and that treaty was a treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union in which both parties renounced all territorial and financial claims on each other and established friendly relationships. In 1924, he became somebody who only engaged in academic duties as a member of the Academy of Science in the Soviet Union. And I mention this to say he was a really successful communist. He was at the heart of the Bolshevik regime. He was not a nobody. He was a very, very important person. And yet, he didn't survive, like so many others, the trials. He was killed in 1937. And he was killed as a consequence, as I already mentioned, of his understanding that the rule of law is not something that can be applied in a communist society. He argued that the legal form is historically specific. It belongs to specific social relations, and these relations are relations characterized by commodity exchanges. As a consequence, he argued, there can be no such thing as a proletarian rule of law or socialist rights. In communism, the relations between communist individuals, he argued, is not regulated by an independent rule of law that recognizes them as abstract citizens. He argued that the association of communist individuals is in control of itself, rather than being controlled by an external rule of law. So he argued in his general theory of law and Marxism that the withering away of certain categories of bourgeois law in no way implies their replacement by new categories of proletarian law. Just as the withering away of the categories of value, capital, profit, and so forth will not mean the emergence of new proletarian categories of value, capital, and profit. And as you noticed, by the use of withering away, I was just quoting from Pashukanis, is of course a key Leninist term. So when he made these points, he saw himself as a Leninist, not as a detractor from Leninist dogma. After his killing in 1937, he fell into relative obscurity. And his book was only rediscovered in the early 1970s in the context of the state derivation debate of the 1970s. And this state derivation debate, which was particularly prominent in the then West Germany and the UK, asked his question. And his question was, why does the ruling class not rule directly? Why is its rule mediated through the independent institution of the state as a seemingly neutral political form of society? Why, he asked, are the relations of private property, why do they assume the form of a legal relationship? Why does the commodity owner assume the form of a legal subject that is governed by the rule of law, by the law of private property, and by the obligations of private property? The state derivation debate, or his, as it were, rediscovery during the state derivation debate, was largely confined to these questions. And although interest in Pashukanis is cyclical, every 10 years, I guess, people start reading him again, and then there are conferences, as they are this year, to celebrate the centenary of the first publication of his book. There is little critical scrutiny of his work. His work says, freedom connects with exploitation. Legal equality connects with exploitation. But in fact, he does not, scrutinize this. Great chunks of his book are devoted to discuss with other Soviet legal scholars about the fate of law in socialism and in communist. And there he was a radical and paid the price for it. He engages with great lengths with Western legal philosophy, but does not discuss in depth, with great scrutiny, his claim and assertion that legal form connects with exploitation. These issues were raised, as far as I'm aware, by only two commentators in the early 1970s. One was Antonio Negri, and the other was Oskar Negt, whom you might not know. He was a quite famous, still is quite famous student of Adorno. And they're both from different perspectives. In 1974 and 75 said, Pashukanis merely argues on the level of the circulation of commodities. He just looks at individual commodity owners and how they, as legal subjects, are regulated by the rule of law when they are on the market and exchange one commodity for another. What he does not do, they say, is to dig into the production process. He doesn't consider the production of wealth. He merely looks at the circulation of that, what has been produced. In a way, I guess, this separation between production and circulation is bogus, because what has been produced needs to be circulated for it to be socially valid and for it to be validated in the form of exchange. Yet, it is true that Pashukanis does not go into the production process, which is the process of exploitation. He merely asserts that the legal form connects and is therefore the form of bourgeois or capitalist exploitation. He does not show how and what the consequences of that are for the form of law itself. Pashukanis argues that the law can only be understood as the legal form of specific social relations. And he says these specific social relations are bourgeois relations. And bourgeois relations, he says, are relations of commodity exchange. But he just looks at the exchange on the market, where people sell whatever they have produced. But he doesn't look into the commodity exchange relationship between capital and labor on the labor market. So he says in my edition 124, page 124, that only the development of the market creates the possibility of and necessity for transforming the person appropriating things by his labor into a legal owner. And I find this formulation of his problematic for his assertion that the legal form connects with exploitation. Because the idea, I quote again, a person appropriating things by his labor does not entail class relations. It is the petty producer who produces his own veg, his own apples and fruits, and then goes onto the market to sell it as a legal owner of that, what he himself or she herself has produced. It excludes, in fact, the relation between buyer and seller of labor power. It excludes, therefore, the understanding that the person producing things is, in fact, the worker whose labor power is consumed by the capitalist. So this is why I think Negri and Negt do well. And this is now what I will be looking at myself. And I will be guided here by a quotation from Marx that I'm now going to read out to you. The constant sale and purchase of labor power is the form, the content is the constant appropriation by the products of labor, by the capitalist without an equivalent. So there we have form, the form of contract, the form of law, the form of equivalence, the form of freedom, the form of equality. And the content of that, the quotation says, is the constant appropriation of the products of labor by the capitalist without an equivalent. So let's look at that in more depth by turning to Marx. And before I do that, in my view, Pashukanis' notion that the concept of proletarian law or the concept of socialist law cannot be endorsed by communists or socialists, because it assumes that socialism or communism amounts to a perfected form of the bourgeois form of law. And this critique of this notion becomes much stronger once one discusses the form of law as the form assumed by exploitation and economic bondage. So I start with chapter 6 now of Marx's Capital. Chapter 6 deals with the buying and selling of labor power. Marx argues that the presupposition, the historical premise of this trade on the labor market is in fact the free laborer, as somebody who is free from the means of subsistence and is free from the means from the land. So as somebody who has been set free from the land and from the means of life, and who is free to trade as a self-responsible property owner. And just in case, yesterday, remember when we were talking about Smith, I mentioned to you that Smith conceives of the three classes of society as one, the master class, is the capitalist, who owns the means of life, according to Smith. Then there is the landlord class, who owns the land. And there is the worker, who owns the ability to work, the hands. So if you look at the laborer really is free from the land and free from the means of life, and free to make a living by the use of his or her hands. And Marx says this is the absolute historical presupposition, or precondition, and the premise of the existence of a labor market as a market in trade between buyers and sellers of labor power. The doubly free laborer, free from the means of life and free to trade his or her commodity, which is the commodity labor power. Towards the end of this chapter, Marx comes with a very strong and important analytical assumption. He says that this trade between capital and labor is taking place in the absolutely best possible condition. It takes place in the Eden of the innate rights of man. Best possible condition. And he comes up with this analytical assumption in order to show that exploitation is not a consequence of discrimination, but that exploitation occurs in the best possible conditions of trade, in the best possible conditions which he calls the Eden of the innate rights of man. So he excludes from his analysis gendered labor markets, where women are paid less. He excludes the idea of racialized labor markets, where ethnic minorities earn less because of the color of their skin. He doesn't exclude that because it doesn't happen. He excludes it in order to show that profiteering is not a consequence of discrimination. That profiteering takes place in the best possible world of an exchange on the labor market. An exchange governed, he says, by equality, by liberty, by equivalence. He argues in this best possible world, a world of the Eden, of the innate rights of man. Everybody is treated as an equal before the law and not discriminated against as a consequence of their gender, their ethnicity, their accent, their education. Everybody is treated equally as a citizen of standardized rights. He says, nobody is forced to do anything at all. They are all at liberty to pursue their own interests. They are free. They're not owned by anyone. They can make choices. You don't have to work for that employer or for the other employer, and the employer does not have to hire you or you because you went to go to the same school. Everybody has freedom from everybody else. Everybody is at liberty as an equal before the rule of law, and everybody pursues their own interests. Most importantly, he says, equivalent is exchanged for equivalent. So if I, being found few in number, buy your labor power, I don't buy it or purchase it by paying you less than it is worth. I'm paying you according to its value, Marx argues in this chapter, on this basis of this analytical assumption, to show that exploitation is not a consequence of me paying you less than the value of your labor power. I pay you according to the value of what you are selling. I'm not receiving you. I'm not robbing you. I'm not underpaying you. I'm paying you according to the value of what you are trying to sell to me. And he argues that the value of labor power, I know it gets a little bit complicated, but don't worry, is the value like in any other commodity. It is the socially necessary labor time required for its production and reproduction. So it's the value of the labor power is basically what the worker requires to make a living and to bring forth living offsprings, future laborers. So there's a way of thinking about it. It's something like the minimum wage or the living wage, something that you need to have in order to make a living, something that you need to get in order to ensure your existence and your reproduction and that of your offspring. And I'm paying you that as an equal before the law, in freedom and liberty, each one of us pursuing our own ends. Our ends are not the same. I'm buying your labor power to valorize it, to make a profit from its consumption. That is clearly understood when we contract. You're selling your labor power, not to make me rich. You're selling your labor power to make a living. So our interests are opposed, but they converge in the form of contract. So far, okay? That's chapter 6. Let us follow briefly what happens in the process of me consuming what I have acquired and what you have relinquished. Now we are in the consumption process of living labor. You're not taking off your hands, you're coming with me as seller, and I now transform from a buyer into a user of what I have bought. And here Marx says that I'm transforming into a vampire. No, time is money, isn't it? I don't take you to the factory to say, all right, sit down, have a cigar, have a cup of coffee. Don't work too fast. Life is short, enjoy it while you can. That's not why I'm hired. I didn't hire you. You didn't sell yourself. I hired and bought your labor power. Unfortunately, you have to come with it. I bought it for the express purpose of making a profit, in competition with all other sellers and buyers of labor power. Time is money. There is no time to lose. So I'm coming with vampires sitting on your knees, putting my teeth into your throat, and I start sucking. What do you do about it? Well, you might struggle, huh? Because you will say, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, you didn't sell yourself. You sold your labor power with the express purpose of making a living. And force decides between two equal rights, and now the state comes down on our relationship and say that I can suck you only for 8 hours, not 12. Okay? Yeah. Let me symbolize that just a little bit. Let's assume the value of your labor power concerning the length of the working day is 120 pounds or euros. You work for 12 hours. You agree to that, no? You signed the paper. I wasn't hiding that fact from you. It's in the contract. And I'm paying you 10 pounds per hour. So after 12 hours, wonderful, no? You're still alive, you got your 120 pounds, and off you go. How long would it take me to make these 120 pounds from your labor? How long would you have to work to produce commodities that I can sell for these 120 pounds? 12 bloody hours? That would bankrupt me. You need to produce these 120 pounds in the form of new commodities much quicker than that. And I'm sure you will. Yeah? Let's assume you're producing the 120 pounds in 6 hours of labor. So you have reproduced the value of your labor power in the form of these new commodities in 6 hours. Here are your 120 pounds. I've got them back. And you continue to work for another 6 hours. Let's assume you produce the same value then. How much do I have? I've got 240. Yeah? So far okay? Now, you are a wise guy. You say, hey, you got your 120 pounds back in 6 hours. Arrivederci. I'm going home. What will I say as a buyer of your labor power? You're violating the terms of the contract. I bought your labor power for 12 hours, not for 6, and now you bug off. You violated the contract. What do I do with violators of contract? I can take you to court. Too expensive. I let you go. Will I hire you again? Not you, sorry. Will I buy your labor power again from you? Never. Nor does my competitor. They know you. You're not meeting the terms of contract. But I'm a good guy. I pay you for these 6 hours. How much do I pay you? I pay you 60. 10 pounds per hour. I still need 60 out of it. So far, okay? So, here we have money is put to buy labor power, and more money comes out. Money with an increment. These first 6 hours, you're producing for me the money I invested in. In these 6 hours, you're producing the increment that Marx calls surplus value. So far, okay? So keep this in mind for when I will be discussing chapter 24.1, because this has consequences, not for the form of the innate, or of the Eden, of the innate rights of man, but for its content. So, chapter 23, Marx deals with the reproduction of the class relationship. And he assumes, another analytical assumption, he assumes that time is money. I consumed your labor power. I have more now as a consequence of your work, if I'm a master, the capitalist, than before. I extracted surplus value from you. My initial investment, 120, is now 240. I'm a really happy man. But he says, I'm going to spend these 120 that I now have more than before for my own pleasure. I'm off to the beach. That's what I do. Simple reproduction. So I'm enriched. And what happened to you? You have been paid. I paid you. According to the contract, which we got into in liberty and freedom, each pursuing our ends as equals before the law, no violation of the rules of private property, of the Eden of human rights has taken place. I bought your labor power, I worked it for 6 or for 12 hours according to contract, and I appropriate the surplus that you produce. It's not yours, you produce the surplus, but it's not yours. Because I bought your labor power, you worked for me, for my benefit. I acquired it, you relinquished it, I appropriate the surplus. And I am now enriched, and I'm happy. What happens to you? I paid you a wage. What you do with the wage? Off you go, onto the commodity market. And there is the collective capitalist. And you give the wage back to the collective capitalist in exchange for what you require to subsist. You buy apples and pears and clothing and, I don't know, pasta, whatever you need to have, some clothing. So you return the wage to me in exchange for the commodities that you produced. So far, okay? But you have been watered, you have been fed, you have been clothed, I have been enriched, your wage is back in my pocket in exchange for the commodities that you produced for me. And what now? And you're ready to sell again. Because you still haven't got the means of subsistence. You spend the wages in order to exist, and now you exist, and your access to food depends on the next contract of work. So you reproduced yourself, quoting from Marx, as the living material for the production of surplus value. Yeah? So the class relationship has been reproduced. On the one hand, the capitalist, who comes out of this process enriched, and on the other hand, the laborer, who has been fed and watered and clothed, ready to work again, ready to make a contract, ready to enter the Eden of human rights again, to sell his or her labor power as an equal in liberty and freedom, pursuing his ends for the sake of sustaining their access to the means of subsistence. So Marx argues quote, "The worker belongs to capital before she has sold herself to the capitalist. You really depend on me, enriching myself through your labor for your subsistence. The wage allows you to reproduce yourself, to feed, to water, and there you are, back on the labor market, desperate to find a guy like me to say, oh, I'm offering you a contract to sign, a contract of work." Has this Eden of human rights been violated in any way? Clearly, you are in a condition of economic bondage. Your acquired freedom forces you to trade on the labor market. It's true. You need to sell in order to dodge the freedom of starvation. Clearly, you cannot run away from me because you need me as employer to make a living. Marx says the acquired freedom of the worker says that he or she comes under the lash of hunger. The worker cannot run away. We have a situation here, he says, of economic compulsion, of economic bondage. Nobody is dependent on anybody else personally. You're working for me not because I demand. No, you turn up voluntarily. And I might or might not make a contract with you. But he says, the slave in Roman time was held by fetters. The free laborer, he says, is kept by invisible threads. Has the Eden of human rights been violated? Not at all. You're still free. We are still equals before the law. We are still at liberty from each other. You can spend the money in any way you want. You can buy this shampoo or that shampoo. I know you will be buying shampoo, but you have the freedom of choice between this and that. You can change employer, but an employer you will have to have. Has the Eden of human rights been violated through the economic bondage? Through your reproduction as readily available human material as a resource for my enrichment? No, this has not been violated. It's just that bourgeois freedom connects with exploitation. That bourgeois equality connects with exploitation. And that in a scenario of the best possible way, best possible conditions. It's not because of gender discrimination or ethnic discrimination and other forms of discrimination on the labor market that I make my profit. I assumed in my presentation the best possible world. No discriminatory practices. You are paid according to the value of the commodity you are selling. I'm treating you as an equal regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of accent, regardless of Christ knows where you're from. No, I treated you as an equal before the law, an equal to me as an employer, in the best possible world. Of course, the existence of discriminatory labor markets adds to the argument. But it doesn't make the argument of exploitation. So far, okay? Yeah? So let's turn briefly to chapter 24.2. I take that first, the second section of chapter 24. Here Marx talks about accumulation. And Marx wants to know here, what does the capitalist convert surplus value in the form of profit back into additional economic activity. Why does the capitalist do that? Why not simply do really that? Get enriched and go to the beach. Be a good person. Stretch out. Get a sunburn. Not a tan. Sunburn. Why? And it says the capitalist has to accumulate, has to add the surplus value into additional investment in order to prevent bankruptcy, in order to prevent liquidation, in order to prevent default. The capitalist, he says, can only prevent the bankruptcy or devaluation of his capital by accumulating, by increasing the productivity of labor, through the introduction of new methods of production, to the increase of the whole scale of the operation. Profit, he says, is not the purpose. Profit is a means. Profit is a means of preventing bankruptcy. And bankruptcy can only be prevented by putting profit also back into productive investment. Accumulation for accumulation's sake. Money making for money making's sake. Not for a big castle. No, for concrete buildings, lots of concrete. No beauty, just horrible buildings. Speculation. So, it is the capitalist competition that forces the capitalist, he says, to preserve his capital. But he or she can preserve their capital only by accumulating through economic growth, by putting extracted surplus value into a new investment. So far, okay? So what does that do to the Eden of human rights? Let's look at that. And I will look at that by taking this off. So accumulation means that this bit here now becomes my part of my new investment. It's getting bigger, no? Yes. It's that and that. Now look at successive cycles. Suddenly, my M is an M, by the way, is pretty big, no? And my original M sits down here. Okay? So all this in excess to this M, to this little m, is the accumulated surplus value over time. Okay? Part of the liberal argument, Marx argues, is the property of self-earned. Which part of the big M is self-earned? If the premise is correct. This little one down here. If the premise is correct, then this is self-earned. The rest is the conversion of the extracted surplus value into a means by which another man or woman is bought. Sorry, I made the same mistake again. The labor market is not a slave market. You don't sell yourself as a person. So it's not the buying and selling of men and women. It's the buying of labor power. So by converting the extracted surplus value into a fund which buys additional labor power, means that the workers are in fact employed by the surplus product or the surplus value that has previously been extracted and appropriated from them. Can you see that argument? Yeah. So I employ you, I consume you for 12 hours in terms of the earlier example. I appropriate the surplus value which you produced for me. I'm very grateful and thankful, thank you very much. And then I put this extracted surplus value into an investment fund to buy additional labor power. So this additional labor power is paid for as a consequence of my earlier or previous exploitation of it. So far, okay? And that, he says, what the liberal economist means by self-earned property. Has the Eden of human rights been violated? Did we not exchange as equals before the law? Throughout we did. Were you not in liberty? Yes, you were. Did I not pay you for your power according to its value? Oh, yes, I did. It has not been violated, the Eden of human rights. And yet, he says, I quote from Marx, the whole thing remains, he says, the age-old activity of the conqueror who buys commodity from the conquered with the money he has stolen from them. So here I go on. I'm a pirate. I'm off to Latin America. I steal the gold of the indigenous people, and then I use that gold to employ them, to work for me. In a trade that is between equals before the law, no coercion, we are at liberty, each pursuing their own ends. In this scenario, is slightly different, because the money that I stole from you, is in fact the surplus value that you produced through the production process, that belongs to me as a consequence of the law of private property. It's not yours, it's mine. And I use that extracted surplus value to buy your commodity again, in an exchange governed by the Eden of human rights. Equivalence exchange between equals at liberty, each pursuing their own ends, and I do not discriminate on the basis of gender, ethnicity, or any other forms of discrimination. So he says, nothing has been violated here. But the Eden of human rights, he says, becomes a mere semblance, a mere form, which is alien to the content of the transaction itself and merely mystifies it. It mystifies it because it makes it seem on the one hand that exploitation is a consequence of discriminatory practices. It merely mystifies it because, one could say, a fair day's wage for a fair day's working day, which is the trade union slogan, and quite rightly so. It mystifies it. It mystifies it because it connects with exploitation. It connects with the dodge of the age-old conqueror who buys the commodities of the conquered with the money he has stolen from them, without, in fact, making that visible in our business transaction on the labor market, which is governed by the principles of an Eden of human rights as an Eden of freedom, of liberty and equality and of utility, each pursuing their own ends. Now, I said at the beginning, Pashukanis says that the legal form, without showing it, is a form that connects with exploitation, that connects with, in other words, the valorization of living labor. And therefore, he says, the legal form cannot be the basis of a proletarian society, because in its content, it is a form of the law of private property, and the law of private property is the law of valorization of somebody else's labor. And thus he concludes, Pashukanis, that the proletarian rule of law, or socialist rights of property, have no place in a communist society. And there is our legal scholar, Pashukanis, being shot as a consequence of that insight. Thank you very much.